January 1944. High above Central Europe. The air is thin, brittle, unforgiving. At 25,000 feet, sunlight glints off long streams of American bombers pushing east. Engines droning in rigid formation, vapor trails, stitch-white scars across the winter sky. Below them, dark shapes begin to climb. German pilots see the escorts first. Big, heavy, awkward. They have a name for it already. Inelegant, overweight, no match for a seasoned Luftwaffe fighter. A machine that should not belong this high, this far from home. The American pilots feel the tension before they see the enemy. Oxygen masks hiss softly. Hands tighten around control sticks. Ahead, the bombers hold their course. There will be no turning back. Then the sky compresses in 2 seconds. The escorts roll, dive, accelerate. 8 gun ports line, each wing of the American fighter, silent for now, waiting. The German attack begins as it always has. Fast, confident, ruthless. But 'tis time when the American fighter answers. The air itself seems to tear open, and mockery dissolves into something far more dangerous. Sudden, violent disbelief. And to understand why this moment mattered, we must step back to the air war that made it inevitable. By the time American fighter escorts met German interceptors in force over Europe, the air war had already become a brutal contest of doctrine, industry, and endurance. In 1942 and early 1943, the United States entered the European theater with confidence shaped more by theory than experience. American planners believed daylight precision bombing could break Germany's industrial spine. The idea was simple and uncompromising. Heavily armed bombers, flying in tight formations, would defend themselves with overlapping fields of fire. Fighters, it was believed, were secondary. Reality arrived quickly. The bombers belonged to the 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England. Their targets lay deep inside occupied Europe and the German heartland. Ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, each mission pushed farther inland, beyond the reach of early Allied fighter escorts. Waiting for them was an enemy already hardened by years of war. The Luftwaffe entered 1943 with an experienced corps of pilots who had fought over Poland, France, Britain, the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Front. Many were veterans of hundreds of combat hours. They understood interception, energy fighting, and coordinated attack better than any air force in the world. They also understood American bombers. German tactics were fighters climbed ahead of bomber streams, then attacked from optimal angles, head-on passes, to minimize exposure to defensive guns, followed by slashing dives through the formation. Losses were expected, but so were kills, and the numbers favored Germany. By late 1942, unescorted daylight raids were suffering catastrophic casualties. Bombers fell burning across Europe. Crews were lost, not by dozens, but by hundreds. Entire missions returned, shattered, or failed to return at all. American leadership faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Night bombing, seeded accuracy, halting the offensive seeded initiative. The answer, increasingly obvious, lay in escort fighters capable of surviving deep penetration missions, fighters that could climb high, stay long, and fight hard. Yet early American escorts struggled. Some lacked range, others lacked altitude performance. Against sleek German interceptors, many American fighters were viewed by the enemy, and sometimes by their own pilots, as inadequate. This imbalance bred confidence among German pilots. They believed they understood American aircraft, American tactics, and American limitations. When new American fighters appeared in the skies, they were judged quickly, sometimes too quickly. And that judgment, rooted in past victories, would soon collide with a machine designed not for elegance, but for endurance, firepower, and punishment. To see why, we must now examine the conditions that gave birth to that aircraft, and the expectations surrounding it. The fighter that would challenge German assumptions did not emerge from elegance or tradition. It emerged from requirement, blunt, uncompromising, and industrial. American designers were not trying to build a duelist. They were trying to build a survivor. By 1940, U.S. Army Air Force's planners understood that future air combat over Europe would be fought at extreme altitudes. Bombers operated high to avoid flak and improve navigation accuracy. Escorts would need to climb fast, operate above 25,000 feet, and still retain the ability to fight on the way down. That requirement eliminated many traditional design compromises. The aircraft that resulted was massive by fighter standards, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R280 radial engine, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. It carried a turbo supercharger system routed through its fuselage. This allowed it to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters gasped and weakened. The trade-off was size. Weight, bulk. To German eyes, the aircraft looked wrong. Too wide. Too thick. Too slow to turn. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to value agility, climb rate, and turning performance. They flew lean, narrow machines built to exploit energy and finesse. Against that tradition, the American fighter appeared crude, a brute attempting to masquerade as a thoroughbred. German intelligence reports and pilot gossip reinforced the impression. Early encounters suggested the aircraft could not dogfight effectively. Its roll rate at certain speeds was sluggish. Its turning circle was wide. 2 pilots raised on the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf. These were fatal flaws, but those judgments missed the aircraft's purpose. American doctrine did not expect escorts to win turning contests. They were designed to fight vertically diving attacks, high-speed passes, and controlled disengagements. The fighter's weight, often mocked, gave it exceptional dive performance. Once it pointed its nose downward, few piston-engine fighters could follow without structural risk. Most importantly, it carried firepower unmatched by any single-engine fighter in the European theater. 8 heavy machine guns were mounted across its wings, synchronized not for delicate precision, but for saturation. When fired together, they created a dense cone of high-velocity projectiles capable of shredding aircraft structures in fractions of a second. German pilots accustomed to lighter armament underestimated what such concentration meant in a single firing pass. Equally critical was survivability. The aircraft was built to absorb punishment. Its radial engine lacked the vulnerable liquid cooling systems of inline designs. Armor plating protected vital components. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Pilots often returned with holes punched clean through wings and fuselage damage that would have doomed lighter fighters. At first, none of this mattered to the enemy. German pilots believed experience would compensate for brute force. They believed skill would defeat size. They believed they had seen this before. What they had not yet seen was how doctrine, industry, and firepower could converge in one moment and overturn everything they thought they knew about air combat. That realization would not come in theory, but in fragments of metal, shattered canopies, and the sudden violence of a firing pass that could not be ignored. The first angle through which this confrontation must be understood is human. American fighter pilots arriving in England in 1943 were not naive, but they were new to this particular war. Many had trained extensively in the United States, mastering formation, flying, gunnery, and navigation. Few had faced a coordinated, veteran enemy in sustained combat. They were acutely aware of that imbalance. Across the Channel, German pilots represented the opposite condition. The Luftwaffe no longer rotated airmen out of combat. Experience accumulated brutally. Survivors became experts. By 1943, some German pilots had more combat sorties than entire American squadrons combined. This experience bred confidence and sometimes contempt. When German pilots encountered the new American fighter, they interpreted it through this lens. They judged it by visual impression and early engagement results. Large fighters had been beaten before. Weight had always meant weakness. That assumption shaped tactics. German interceptors favored attacks that forced turning fights. They believed that once an engagement slowed and flattened, the American aircraft would lose. Initial encounters often followed this script and reinforced German confidence. But American pilots were trained differently. U.S. doctrine emphasized energy management. Pilots were instructed not to turn with the enemy unless necessary. Instead, they were taught to attack from altitude, strike hard, and disengaged vertically. This boom-on-zoom approach minimized exposure and exploited speed rather than agility. Early losses among American units were real. Learning under fire always is. But survivability mattered. Pilots lived to learn. They returned with damaged aircraft, studied combat reports, and adjusted tactics. Each mission sharpened understanding. The second angle is tactical. The American fighter excelled in the vertical plane. Its mass translated into momentum. In a dive, it accelerated rapidly, allowing pilots to choose when and where to engage. German fighters attempting to follow often had to break off to avoid structural failure or loss of control. This altered engagement geometry. Instead of extended dogfights, combat became a series of violent, fleeting passes. Seconds of firing. Immediate separation, repositioning for another strike. German pilots, accustomed to dictating terms, found themselves reacting instead. The third angle is psychological. Mockery was not just arrogance, it was a coping mechanism. German pilots faced increasing numbers of enemy aircraft. They faced an industrial opponent capable of replacing losses faster than they could. Belittling the enemy's machines offered reassurance. But reassurance erodes quickly when assumptions fail. Each time a German fighter passed through the firing envelope of the American escort, the margin for error narrowed. The old confidence remained, but it was now threaded with doubt. And doubt, in air combat, is often the first sign that the balance is shifting. To understand why that shift became irreversible, we must look beyond men and tactics to the weapon itself, and the effect it had on anyone caught in its path. The fourth angle is technological, and it is where disbelief hardened into respect. Most Luftwaffe fighters carried a mixed armament: cannon for destructive hits, machine guns for aiming and volume. Effective, but dependent on accuracy and timing. A short burst could cripple a bomber or fighter, if it struck correctly. The American escort fighter approached lethality differently. Its 8 heavy machine guns fired in convergence, not to puncture, but to overwhelm. When triggered, they released a dense wall of projectiles, moving at such velocity that evasion within the firing window became nearly impossible. Pilots did not need perfect aim. They needed proximity and timing. German pilots encountering this for the first time described it not as individual impacts, but as a sudden tearing of space. Aircraft structures, control surfaces, engine components, pilot compartments were vulnerable to saturation. Even brief exposure could be fatal. This firepower altered behavior. German pilots learned quickly that frontal or close-quarter passes were no longer calculated risks. They were gambles. The traditional head-on attack, once favored to minimize exposure time, became dangerous against a fighter that could flood the approach path with fire. The fifth angle is survivability. The American fighter was not designed to avoid damage. It was designed to endure it. Its radial engine could absorb hits that would cripple liquid-cooled designs. Armor protected the pilot and critical systems. Control redundancy allowed damaged aircraft to remain flyable. This mattered not just tactically, but psychologically. German pilots were accustomed to seeing enemies fall when hit. Against this aircraft, that expectation failed. Fighters limped away, trailing smoke, control surfaces shredded, yet still airborne. Pilots who expected kills instead saw returns and reports that contradicted visual confirmation. Survivability extended learning. Each damaged aircraft that returned added to institutional knowledge. Each pilot who survived another mission became more effective on the next. The sixth angle is the enemy. Combat reports began to change. Language softened. Dismissive phrases disappeared. German pilots stopped mocking the aircraft's appearance and started noting its strengths. Dive speed, firepower, toughness. More importantly, tactics adjusted. Attacks became more cautious. Engagement distances increased. Pilots broke off sooner. All of this reduced effectiveness against the bombers the fighters were meant to destroy, and that was the true measure of impact. The American fighter did not need to dominate the sky alone. It needed to deny the enemy freedom of action by forcing German pilots to hesitate, to disengage, to survive rather than attack. It achieved its strategic purpose. What began as ridicule ended as recalculation. And recalculation, in war, often precedes a decisive moment, one where theory gives way entirely to experience. By early 1944, the air war over Germany had reached a breaking point. American bomber streams were larger than ever. Escort coverage now extended deep into the Reich. What had once been brief, localized clashes became sustained aerial battles, stretching across hundreds of miles. German interceptors no longer chose when to engage. They were compelled to. On these missions, patterns repeated with grim clarity. German fighters climbed ahead of the bomber formations, positioning for classic interception angles. From their perspective, the escorts still appeared vulnerable, heavy machines circling above the bombers, seemingly unsuited for close combat. The plan remained familiar. Force the escorts into disadvantageous turns, then strike the bombers. But execution unraveled quickly. As German fighters closed, the escorts did not turn inward. They rolled, dove, and accelerated. The engagement compressed vertically. What had once been a horizontal dance became a violent exchange of speed and altitude. Then came the firing passes. American pilots waited longer than expected. They did not spray fire at distance. They held trigger discipline until convergence was unavoidable, until the enemy filled the gun sight. When they fired, it was not a warning. It was a single, concentrated burst. The effect was immediate. Aircraft struck by the fire did not drift away trailing light smoke. Control surfaces failed. Canopies shattered. Engines seized or tore free from mounts. In Manicasse's German pilots had no time to react. The window between engagement and destruction measured seconds. Those who survived the first pass often disengaged instinctively, diving away or breaking off prematurely. The old confidence, the belief that experience could compensate for hardware, fractured under the weight of evidence. The battles intensified as formations moved deeper inland. Multiple waves of German fighters attempted coordinated attacks, but each pass through the escort screen exacted a price. Losses mounted not just in aircraft, but in opportunity. Bombers reached targets with fewer interruptions. Defensive fire remained concentrated. Damage accumulated on the ground. For American pilots, something changed as well. They began to trust the machine fully, not just its engine or its guns, but its ability to bring them home. That trust translated into aggression, controlled, disciplined, but relentless. Escorts pressed attacks not to chase kills, but to deny space. The air over Germany grew hostile in a new way. German pilots were no longer fighting an aircraft. They believed they understood. They were facing a system, a combination of doctrine, firepower, and survivability that punished every mistake and offered no easy solutions. And as these encounters repeated across weeks and months, one truth became unavoidable. The balance of fear was shifting. The next phase would prove that this shift was not temporary. It was decisive. As the spring of 1944 unfolded, the cumulative effect of repeated encounters became impossible to ignore. German interception plans still went forward. They had to. The bomber offensive threatened factories, fuel, supplies, and transportation networks essential to the German war effort. But each sortie now carried a different expectation. Not of opportunity, but of survival. Luftwaffe pilots began adjusting behavior in subtle but telling ways. Engagements were initiated from longer distances. Head-on attacks grew rarer. Pilots broke off earlier, sometimes before firing, rather than risk closing through the escort screen. Those who pressed attacks often did so in isolation, without the tight coordination that had once defined German fighter tactics. This fragmentation mattered. The American escorts did not need to destroy every attacker. They needed to disrupt formations, delay passes, and force disengagements. Each disrupted attack meant bombers reaching targets with fewer losses. Each aborted run compounded this strategic imbalance. Kill ratios reflected the change. While losses continued on both sides, no air superiority was absolute. The Luftwaffe's ability to trade aircraft favorably eroded. Replacement pilots lacked the experience of those lost. Training pipelines shortened. Combat hours dropped. The qualitative edge Germany once relied upon diminished rapidly. Meanwhile, American fighter units, rotated pilots, absorbed lessons, and expanded. Industrial output ensured replacements arrived faster than losses occurred. Aircraft returned from missions riddled with damage were repaired, flown again, and returned to combat. The American fighter became a constant presence, not a novelty, not an exception. German pilots could no longer assume they would encounter unescorted bombers or fragile escorts at the edges of the Reich. Psychology followed material reality. Reports from German units reflected caution bordering on resignation. The language shifted from dominance to endurance. Missions were described as costly, exhausting, and increasingly ineffective. The sky, once a domain of confident interception, became a place of calculated risk and shrinking margins. For American crews, the opposite occurred. Escort pilots reported a growing sense of control. They did not dominate through turning duels or theatrical heroics. They dominated through denial, denying space, denying timing, denying the enemy clean attacks. This was the decisive moment. Not a single battle, not a single day, but a sustained turning point where the Luftwaffe's assumptions collapsed under repetition. What began as mockery ended as avoidance. And with that shift, the strategic bombing campaign crossed a threshold. The bombers would keep coming, and the escorts would keep meeting them in the air. What followed was not just victory in combat, but consequences that reshaped the war itself. The immediate consequence of the shifting air balance was not measured only in aircraft destroyed, but in outcomes achieved. By mid-1944, American bomber formations were reaching targets that had once been considered prohibitively dangerous. Oil facilities, aircraft assembly plants, rail hubs, and synthetic fuel refineries suffered repeated, cumulative damage. Repairs lagged. Output declined. The effects rippled through every branch of the German war economy. This was not coincidence. It was access. Effective escort coverage changed the mathematics of daylight bombing. Where German fighters once imposed a predictable toll on each mission, their attacks now arrived later, less coordinated, and with reduced intensity. Bombers still fell. War never becomes safe, but they reached objectives in sufficient numbers to matter. The cost to the Luftwaffe was deeper than statistics suggested. Aircraft losses could be replaced, though with increasing difficulty. Experienced pilots could not. As veterans were killed or wounded, they were replaced by younger airmen trained under compressed schedules, with fewer flight hours and minimal combat preparation. These pilots entered the sky already at a disadvantage. Against heavily armed escorts, that disadvantage became fatal. Morale suffered in ways no directive could reverse. Interceptor units reported rising fatigue and declining confidence. Missions that once carried the promise of decisive interception now felt like endurance trials. Each engagement forced a choice between duty and survival increasingly won. For American fighter units, the aftermath looked different. Pilots returned with aircraft scarred by combat yet intact, wings patched, engines replaced, control cables rerouted. Each damaged return reinforced belief in the machine and in the system behind it. Squadrons refined tactics further, coordinating vertical attacks, rotating escorts, and maintaining pressure rather than pursuing individual victories. The result was control without spectacle. No dramatic air superiority announcement marked the change. There was only consistency mission after mission where bombers reached targets. Escorts met attackers, and the Luftwaffe failed to impose decisive disruption. By late summer 1944, the air war over Germany had transformed from a contest into an imbalance, and imbalance, sustained long enough, reshapes everything beneath it. But the full weight of that transformation would only become clear when viewed over time, in what the Luftwaffe lost, and what the Allies gained by holding the sky. As 1944 drew toward its close, the consequences of sustained escort dominance extended far beyond individual missions. The Luftwaffe entered the final year of the war, diminished not just in numbers, but in coherence. Fuel shortages, limited training, aircraft sat, grounded for lack of parts. Units were shuffled constantly in response to Allied pressure, eroding coordination and identity. What had once been a force defined by precision now functioned reactively, always behind the tempo of the enemy. For Allied planners, the effects were decisive. With German air resistance weakened, the bombing campaign intensified with greater freedom of movement, Targets were revisited systematically. Transportation networks fractured. Oil production collapsed under repeated strikes. Aircraft production, already strained, faltered as factories were hit faster than they could be repaired. This air superiority enabled more than bombing. It supported the build-up for the invasion of Western Europe. Fighters swept roads, rail lines, and communication hubs. Enemy movement during daylight became hazardous. The sky, once contested, now belonged overwhelmingly to the Allies. The American escort fighter evolved alongside these demands. As opposition thinned at altitude, it was increasingly employed in ground attack roles. Its rugged construction and heavy armament proved devastating against vehicles, rail traffic, and troop concentrations. The same survivability that protected pilots in air combat allowed them to operate at low altitude under fire. By war's end, the aircraft's reputation had shifted completely. What began as ridicule ended as recognition not for elegance, but for effectiveness. It was not the fastest, nor the most agile fighter of the war. It did not rely on myth or romance. It relied on engineering, firepower, and doctrine aligned with industrial reality. For German pilots who survived, the memory was not of being outflown in classic duels, but of being overmatched by a system that offered fewer and fewer ways to fight back. And for the war itself, the lesson was unmistakable. Control of the air was no longer about individual brilliance alone. It was about endurance, of machines, of pilots, of production, and of strategy applied without interruption. To understand what this meant, beyond victory and defeat, we must step back one final time and reflect on what this aircraft and this moment revealed about modern warfare. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not a tale of elegance or tradition. It is a story about adaptation, about recognizing the nature of a war and building a machine to meet it without compromise. In the skies over Europe, air combat ceased to be a contest, decided solely by maneuver or individual skill. It became a test of endurance, survivability, and sustained pressure. The Thunderbolt embodied that shift. Its size, once mocked, carried the fuel to stay. Its weight, once dismissed, delivered momentum and protection. Its 8 heavy guns did not reward finesse. They punished proximity. For German pilots, the lesson was harsh and unavoidable. Experience alone could not overcome a system designed to absorb damage, learn continuously, and return in greater numbers. The sky no longer favored those who flew best on a single day, but those who could remain present, mission after mission, without breaking. For the Allies, the aircraft represented something larger than performance statistics. It demonstrated how industrial capacity, doctrine, and engineering could align to change the character of warfare itself. Victory in the air was not won by a single decisive battle, but by denying the enemy space, time, and confidence until resistance thinned into inevitability. The Thunderbolt did not end the war by itself. No aircraft ever does. But it helped secure the conditions under which the war could be ended. By ensuring that bombers reached their targets, armies moved under friendly skies, and daylight belonged to those who could hold it. In that sense, the mockery it once faced was never truly answered by words or reputation. It was answered in the brief, violent moment when 8 streams of fire filled the sky and changed it forever.